It's a pleasure to be here and to meet you. This is not going to be very interactive, I regret to say, because I really would like to get to know you, but my style is non-interactive, at least officially. I advertise myself as non-interactive. That brings me a lot of fans. But I like to feel there is a lot of interaction going on, even though it's not verbal, if you see what I mean. Listening to the list of the names of my books, I realize that I've moved over the years from desire to bewilderment. It started with the beginning of desire, and the last book was called Bewilderments, which is probably the way it goes. I hope desire doesn't disappear entirely in this story. What I want to talk about today, after your long day of trauma, I want to come in really with a case history, a biblical case history of trauma. Now, I think that one finds trauma almost anywhere one looks. I'm of that school of thought. If you look at a work of literature, let's say, of the authority of the Bible, of the human authenticity of the Bible, you are going to find that people are haunted. That people are haunted in one way or another by the past, by their own past, personal past, or by the historical past, by the past of their fathers. But what I want to do today is the purest example of personal trauma that I can think of. And that is the story of Yitzchak, Isaac. I want to focus on the story of the second of the patriarchs. He is a son. He's the son of a father who tried to kill him. Yes, that's one way of putting the story. Under the command of God, that God told him to. And what I'm interested in is what impact, if any, does that event have on him? And when I say if any, that sounds self-understood. Of course there must be an impact from such an event. The interesting thing is that, again, officially, consciously, as the Torah tells the story, there is no reference to that past event in the later life of Isaac. That Isaac doesn't really seem ever to think or talk or have anything to feel about that event. He is actually quite passive during that event. There's no heroic role for him. He is not the hero of the story, in the sense that he lies bound on an altar. No one asks him what he thinks about the whole event. He is bound, passive, as he is in the other main event of his life, which is the story of how he is deceived in old age, at the other end of his life, how he's deceived by one son, so that he gives him the blessing rather than the other son whom he had intended to give it to. Right? He wanted to bless Esau, and instead he blesses Jacob because Jacob deceives him. Right? Again, a very crude way of telling the story. It's quite nuanced, but I'm putting it in very block letters here. In this scene also, which is at the other end of his life, which you could say is the most memorable scene in which he figures non-heroically, it seems. There he is, old, blind, and easy prey for deception. It seems very easy for Jacob to do what he does. And as I say it, I'm assailed by all the nuances. It's really much more complicated than that. But that's the simple outline of the story. And so Isaac seems to me, in a way, the least heroic, the least active, the least interesting of the patriarchs. Abraham and Jacob have more heroic profiles. At the same time, you can't forget that Isaac is the one who loves. The word to love is used of him as it's not of either of the other two patriarchs. I mean, Jacob loves his wife Rachel, but Isaac loves his wife after he's married her, Rebekah. We read he brought her into the tent and he married her and he loved her. It's a sentence of its own. And he loved her. And he is comforted for the loss of his mother. So there's a sense of his emotional life. Very intense sense of his emotional life, which tells us something that we didn't know before. because there was no point in knowing it, and that is that he had been distinctly uncomforted. In other words, that he had really been suffering over the loss of his mother. That we were not told, but when he marries his wife, there is a sense suddenly of an insight into his inner life, that the wife comes to stand in for the mother in some way that is really quite Freudian, certainly according to traditional commentaries. So he loves not only his wife, he loves his son Esau, and again a very definite declaration of love. Vayehav Yitzchak et Esav, and Isaac loved Esav, and Rebekah was always loving Jacob. It's a different form of the verb, ohevet. Whereas with Isaac, there's something very definite and active about it. He loved Esau. And that's why he chooses to bless him. There's no other real reason. The real reason is that he just loves him. He also loves, if that's not pathetic, he loves food. He asks Esau to go and hunt for food and make me matamim, make me tasty food, ta'am, with a lot of taste to it. Make me delicious food, ka'asher ohav, such as I love, such as I will love. Now there's that word, to love, again, and it applies to food in a way that's almost startling. Suddenly this very serious, as we're going to see, traumatized patriarch has a great love of food. He's very susceptible to love of all kinds. There's a certain sensuality in him of all the patriarchs, a sensuality, an emotionality. He not only loves his wife, but he plays with her. Again, it doesn't seem to fit the overall portrait of him that Avimelech, the Philistine king, glimpses him through a window, playing with his wife Rebekah. Playing, mitzachek, clearly has an erotic connotation, and again an unexpected glimpse of Isaac, that he's an erotic being, that he's a sensual being, and that somehow has a place in an overall personality, sexuality, way of being, particular way of being in the world, that I'm interested in trying to profile here. He is different from his father Abraham. The contrast is extreme. Abraham is active, outgoing, makes connections with people, affects people. His whole life is in terms of connection and relationship. It's called chesed in the Kabbalistic stereotype. Whereas Isaac is inward, doesn't seem to have the same world of connections. And for instance, when it comes to the world of prayer, his relation to God, and this is where I really want to launch into the specifics of his story, the first thing we really see Isaac doing in a heroic way, in a way that achieves things in the world, is that he prays to God for his wife, who is barren. And the word that's used for prayer is the beginning of this week's Parsha, the Parshat HaShavua of this week. This is how Isaac, the adult, who is already married and has left the Akedah far behind him, the scene. Are you all familiar with the expression, the Akedah? Yes, the binding scene. He prays to God, and the word that's used is vaye'etar la Hashem lenochach ishto. He prays to God across from his wife. Somehow there's a kind of laser beam of concentration coming from Isaac towards his wife as he focuses on her and prays to God for her because she's barren. And this prayer, the word that's used in Hebrew, vaye'etar, is not a common word for prayer. It's a word that implies tremendous energy, like in a way the modern word for a legal plea. A legal plea is an atira. That's a slightly tamer version of the same root. Atar, meaning to be very persistent, to make a case for something without no holds barred. That is Isaac, something very wholehearted, very invested, in a depth mode. And it's such a powerful claim he makes to God on Rebekah's behalf, that you have the most instant mirroring of a prayer that you ever have in the biblical narrative. What we read is vaye'etar Yitzchak, vaye'ater lo Hashem. Yes, your Hebrew is can follow that. That he does this subversive, as we'll see, this digging towards God. And God is digged towards. God is susceptible to I like that word, susceptible. I've adopted it recently. It's a kind of orphan word. People don't use it very much. But susceptible means somehow you have this strange idea that God has sensibilities, that God somehow is vulnerable to certain things. And he is vulnerable to this kind of prayer. And he allows himself to be vulnerable, and immediately Rebecca becomes pregnant. So you have a kind of attack, something quite aggressive on the part of Isaac. He's not so passive after all, it seems. He's aggressive in a very personal way, in a way that has to do, I would say, with depth. He goes in deep. He doesn't spread himself far and wide. He goes in deep. Abraham is never said to pray. Right? He doesn't pray for his wife when she is barren, and he simply never prays. In the sense of the word is never used, that he prayed. And in fact, the only time it is used is when he's praying for Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, who is suffering from illnesses in his family. The word is used, vayitpalel. But in his own life, he never prays. But on the other hand, we hear him talking to God all the time. That's what he does, Abraham. All right, the text is full of monologues or dialogues as he talks to God, especially about his wife's barrenness, about himself. What are you going to give me if I go childless? What do your promises mean if I don't have anyone to inherit? Quite aggressive, ways of talking to God, in which he says it like it is. It's just not fair. How can you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Right? The plea for Sodom. But it's not called a prayer. There's no official, but what he's doing all the time is talking to God, which I suppose is praying. Praying is not necessarily asking for something. It's a conversation of some kind. So he is not said to pray, but you hear the words of his prayer. Isaac, on the other hand, is said to pray, but you never hear anything he ever says to God. You don't hear any conversation between himself and God, his words to God. It's as if they are too deep inside him. And I'm drawing some of this material that I'm trying to craft now. I'm drawing it from modern Hasidic sources, that is the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. One particular source is called the Bet Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov of Ishbitz, who was the son of the Meir Shiloach, quite a well-known Hasidic master. And he, in a way, is the heir. He inherits traditions that go back to the Midrash, that go back to the Zohar, mystical traditions, and they come out in a modern form, relatively modern. And what he has to say is that Isaac lives in the depths. He uses that word omek, that there is a sense in which his whole life is internal, and that it comes from it is enacted in very deep places. And so it's very rare to hear him actually expressing out there in the world what he wants, what he thinks. Right? There's something very inward, but extremely powerful, that when he chooses Vaye'etar el Hashem, you may not hear the words of his prayers, but God feels the energy of his prayer. There's a kind of internal energy that may not even be expressed in words. It may be mute. It's a mute prayer, as if a mute prayer is the most powerful of all. Somewhere you might almost say that Isaac doesn't trust words, that words are always limitations. They're always limiting, they're always in some way expressive of ego, and that in some way Isaac wants to avoid all distortions, and the purity of who he is can only be known deep down. He engages with depths, and so he doesn't engage in words as he prays to God, but he is mutely praying. Now, that association of Isaac with the depths, which means really, it's one thing to say a person is deep, he's a deep person. You can say it approvingly, he's a profound person. Or you can say it not so approvingly, he's deep. Meaning, in some way, he's obscure. He doesn't let you in on who he is. It's not so easy to tell what's going on in there. Right? There is something uneasy about someone who is deep in that way. Abraham, what you see is what you get. In a certain, not in a negative sense, but in the sense that if you looked at his face, I imagine you would have a pretty good sense of what kind of person he is. It's out there. It's in his relations to people, and it's in his ways of handling things, not always well advised, not always nothing to write home about at certain points, but he doesn't hesitate to engage in that way. And Isaac, you look at him and you don't know who he is, that there is something very inward there. It would be easy just to use the word introvert, but I think there have been recent studies of introvert and extrovert that show that they're quite paradoxical categories, that they really mean almost the opposite sometimes of what you think they mean in popular conceptions. So what you have then is someone who lives in the depths and who prays from the depths, not even using the externality of words. That words are in a way already too lifeless, too formed for him to engage with them. If you look now at the beginning of your source sheet, which you will have, it's in Hebrew and English. I'm rather limited with time, so as far as I'm concerned, I'd be happy to hang around afterwards. But you have other things to do.
Feel free to go, a little bit over. We're not.
Yes, a little bit. Well, what can I say? If it's questions of information, then certainly. In other words, if there's something you don't understand, then certainly. If it's questions of discussion, I suggest waiting for the end. And you can always write to me an email and whatever. I'm happy to continue. Here, what you have is a Talmudic passage, number 1 on your page, that relates to the word that is used for Isaac's prayer, that he's vaye'etar. And there's a pun behind this passage, that word vaye'etar, which may not be recognizable to everyone as meaning prayer, it's not so obvious what it means in the biblical text, is connected perhaps with the word atar, the root atar, which means a pitchfork or a plow. A pitchfork, translated here as pitchfork, I could translate it as a plow as well. A strange question arises. Why is the prayer of the righteous compared to a plow? What is this metaphor behind the word atira, vaye'etar, that form of prayer? It's a plowing prayer. Why is prayer compared to plowing? Just as this plow turns over, mahapech, the produce, from place to place, right? What does the plow do? It goes into the earth and deep down into the darkness of the earth and brings up what's underneath, the rich soil underneath, and puts it on top, and the top goes down. Right? So you have a whole inversion. You have a whole dislocation of the position of things. So the surface becomes depth and depth becomes surface. And that's what a plow does. So, or a pitchfork gets in among the produce and turns it over. So again, changing places, changing locations. So the prayer of the righteous turns over God's attributes, subverts God's attributes, and moves God from a place of anger or strict din, strict justice. Here the word is used as ragzanut, anger, which is extremely anthropomorphic word, that God is angry, to a position of rachmanut, ragzanut, rachmanut. It's crafted. It's a kind of literary crafting to the statement, that they echo each other. The two sides of God, which are usually called din and rachamim, that God has almost a bipolar aspect, if I'm really to push it a little, that he has this and that prayer has the power to get in below the angry surface of God's appearance at that moment and flip and bring up what was underneath, which was compassion, and bury for the moment the anger. It's an extremely anthropomorphic statement. It's theologically highly incorrect. God doesn't change, according to him, the one and only God. doesn't change. He's not subject to time, to changes in place. Right? He's everywhere and at all times, and he knows everything. And he's not susceptible, to come back to my favorite word. In the Midrash, he is highly susceptible. He has one soft spot, and that is for the human. That the human can get at him, can make him angry, and can make him loving. And it has to do with something as human as words. You know, what prayer clothed in words, or in the case of Isaac, a prayer so intense that it doesn't yield to words, but it comes and has that power. And he is the particular individual who is said to have that power, the power of the plow, that he goes in and brings up stuff. That metaphor, it's something that in human life we're very aware of, that we live with moods, can we say? The best of us. You know, that one day we're feeling angry and unloving, and then someone somehow manages to get into our depths, you know, to touch us in such a way that something underneath comes to the surface, and vice versa. Someone makes us angry on a day that we're feeling happy and loving, and suddenly a kind of something else comes to the surface. The Midrash is not shy to apply that logic, that volatile logic of human beings, of how we are in the world, our less dignified dimension, to apply it to God and say that that is the power of prayer, that prayer deals with God as susceptible, treats God as susceptible, and God yields to that impact. And Isaac, of all people, has that power. He has that power perhaps more than anyone, and it's described in the word vaye'etar. He is the plowing person. Here is Mandelstam, the Russian poet Mandelstam. Poetry, he says, is the plow. Right? Poetry too is a plow, not just prayer. Poetry is the plow tearing open and turning over time, so that the deep layers of it, its rich black undersoil, ends up on the surface. That is, what does poetry do? It goes deep down into the past, into the language of the past, into the traumas of the past, into the history of the past, and brings up stuff that has been forgotten, that has fallen into disuse. We don't use that language anymore. And we find that language down there in the dark, and we bring some of it up to the surface, and it's rich black undersoil, the origins of language. And we bring it up, and it changes and transforms and enriches the surface of modern language. And here is the sentence that goes with this, his extraordinary description of mankind, what mankind wants. Mankind craves like a plowman for the virgin soil of time. That we, as human beings, we crave for something virgin, something untouched, not cliched, not lying there on the surface getting old and well used, something that goes back to the beginning, something authentic, and we want to bring some of that back. So there's a kind of desire, a plowman's desire that poets have, and those who read poetry have. They don't go for what is correct and true in the obvious sense, what works in terms of modern diction. They want in some way to complicate the surface. They want poetry is complicated rather than why would anyone bother with something that's complicated rather than simple if there weren't a desire for the virgin soil of time, somewhere that time should be, the past should impregnate the present in some way. So that is Mandelstam on poetry, and that is the Midrash on prayer as having the same ambition in a certain sense. And that is Yitzchak, that is Isaac. He's a tunneler, he's a plowman, he's a burrower. Right? He's someone who knows that the truth is down there, that there's a truth down there, and it's a dark truth. It's a truth that he might well ignore if he wants to stay on the surface of things, but he can't stay on the surface. Something makes him aware that he has to encounter what is underneath. And that's the first midrash that I wanted to draw your attention to. The second one, which is related to it, relates to Isaac's blindness at the end of his life. How come he suddenly becomes blind at the end of his life? A big point is made of it in the narrative, in the biblical narrative, that he becomes blind. Right, chapter 27, which is the chapter of the misblessing, the misspoken blessing, begins with a statement that Isaac became old, "Vatichena einav mirot," and his eyes became dim, kahu, so that he couldn't see. Me ro'ot, he was blocked from seeing. Now, is it unusual for someone who becomes old to lose his sight? Obviously not. Particularly before modern medicine, it was simply came with the territory, that in old age you lose your vision. So why is such a point made of it here, that he loses his vision, and there's a sense of a real loss, a blunting? Kehe means he went dark. He went dark, he lost the light, he lost the sense of sharpness, of sharp edges. It's absolutely a loss. Why emphasize that so much if it's just part of what comes with old age? One answer that's offered by Rashi is because the whole story that's going to follow, the story of the blessing and the deception, wouldn't happen, wouldn't be able to happen if he were not blind. So in some sense, it's a necessary blindness in terms of the plot. Right? It's a kind of callous understanding. Rashi says, in order that Jacob should take the blessing. There's a kind of inversion of our normal, ethical way of reading the story, where we really deplore the way that Jacob came by the blessing. We can't help feeling that the most pious among us feel, wouldn't it have been nice if it could have been got any other way, rather than by deception, by exploiting his father's blindness. That is the embarrassing aspect of the story. And here comes Rashi and presents us with a different sensibility, with a challenging one, that in order that he should get the blessing just in the way he did, as if there is something valuable about the way he did, which Isaac had to be blind. So it's emphasized in the story. It's a necessary, in terms of the plot, it's a necessary blindness. A different way of saying it, you can see in the next passage on your page. It's a very famous midrash, but the actual words of the midrash are not always quoted, and I think are important. Have a look at number 2. Retranslates the Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew. His eyes became dim, me ro'ot, as a result of seeing. A traumatic blindness. That's what the midrash is going to describe now. That he became blind because of what he had seen. And goes on to put it like this. At the time that Abraham bound his son on the altar, the angels wept in heaven. They wept for Isaac. And their tears dropped from their eyes into his eyes. V'nashru d'ma'ot me'enehem l'toch einav. It's an uncanny, precise vision of Isaac lying bound on the altar, absolutely helpless, like a trussed animal, without able to move at all, but his eyes are open. Right? Perhaps I prefer not to think of that. That his eyes, he's lying there, and the only thing in his body that's active is his eyes. And his eyes are searing the heavens. They are looking upwards at the heavens. He's looking for God. He's trying to look at God, the Midrash will go on to say. He's trying to break through his situation in some way. And into his open eyes drop the tears of angels who are trained right on top of him. As it were, the angle of fall is such that he doesn't weep his own tears, that what he has in his eyes are the tears of the angels, who are some expression of himself, right? Some hypostasized expression of himself. They are him, they are not him, right? They belong to the world above, they belong to him. And in some way, some tears that are not entirely his drop into his eyes and are preserved in his eyes. V'hayu reshumot b'toch einav. Reshumot means imprinted. It's a very particular word, roshem. Imprinted, there was an impression deep in his eyes of the angel's tears. Right? He didn't weep those tears, that he kept them. He kept them inside, And at the end of his life, when he became old, he became blind. It's as if there is a latency now, which is a result. You know what I mean by a latency? That's the psychological, psychoanalytic word that's used to describe the effect of trauma. That what characterizes trauma is the delay, the strange delay that's sometimes experienced, often experienced, between the event, the original event, the accident, as Freud called it. Freud was the first to enter into this whole area, that there's a delay between the moment of trauma, of the actual wound. Trauma means wound. The actual wound and the impact on the life of the sufferer. There is a sense in some way, but this is the way Freud puts it, that someone could have survived a train wreck. This was just at the beginning of the 20th century, when trains were beginning to become a form of mass transit. And they offered a new, terrible possibility for mass trauma, for mass tragedy. Large numbers of people at one moment without warning. And this person that he's interested in, the survivor, walks away apparently undamaged, unscathed from the accident. It has not wounded him. And the only thing is that maybe years later, he begins to have flashbacks. Things come back to him, moments come back to him. It's not the usual memory, not connected memory, but moments of flashback, nightmares, distorted attacks of something. The impact is felt only much later. And this has become, for what Freud described, he was describing also the effect of shell-shocked soldiers after the First World War. How this would happen, people would come back, and a while later would begin to demonstrate symptoms. Took time. When I first started being interested in this whole issue of trauma, which was many years ago, before it became a fashionable word, before it became a word, an overused word, I'd almost say, it felt like an exotic word at that time. I remember fishing around in my mind for it, trying to find a word that would describe what I'm thinking about. And I remember reading an article about Cambodian women who had been saved and brought to America, and a year after, for some reason it was usually a year afterwards, began to go blind. Very precisely like this. And the psychologists and the doctors tried to understand this, and in the end they said there's nothing else for it. We just have to say that they became blind because of what they have seen. You know, that somewhere what they have seen has been buried inside them and now has come to terrible flower. You know, it comes out. And this is what what the Midrash describes here as something that happens in old age. That means after a considerable delay, as a result of that original act, that original experience. Now, this sketch of the history of Isaac means that the blindness was always latent inside him. It isn't actually experienced till much later. I witnessed my own father, who was a survivor of the Shoah, and lived a perfectly normal life in any way that anyone else could tell, until in old age he began to talk. And even then, it wasn't in an extreme form, but he just began to talk about dreams. He began to talk about dreams, and he was mystified by these dreams that had not been there all these years, and suddenly were there. So I feel as if I was very close to something of this order, although not in an extreme form. Isaac has been through something here that has left him imprinted. That something is there inside him now. I want to quote the testimony of someone who dealt with the witnesses. Sorry. Thank you. The witnesses to the trauma, for instance, of the Holocaust, and that is Claude Lanzmann, who made the great film Shoah. He took 11 years to make it. It's a film long in preparation. And he spent time at the beginning doing all the reading, trying to understand this phenomenon of the Shoah. And he felt that by the time he met his first witness, and he was going to base his whole film on interviews with witnesses, by the time he met his first witness, he thought he really understood something about the Shoah. He'd done all the work. And then when he met his first witness, he said he realized the obscenity of understanding. That understanding is simply something to be avoided, because understanding prevents you from ever understanding. The first thing to be understood, if you want to access the impossibility, the incomprehensibility of a phenomenon like the Shoah, is to be in a place of not understanding. To know that there's no way of understanding. Now, there are certain facile ways of using that idiom. This is the event that was completely incomprehensible. It can become a kind of alibi for never making any attempt to engage with it. And that's precisely not what he means. What he means is that you're prevented from engaging by ready-made knowledges, by knowledges that you come at by way of protecting yourself from the inaccessibility of this moment. It's inaccessible for the victim as well as for the interviewer. And that's what comes across over and over again in the film. The sense of the horror of what happened comes across in the survivors who can't really engage, who can't really remember what happened to them. And with the callousness, apparently, of the interviewer, of Lanzmann himself, who is a voice off screen, speaking a foreign language sometimes, the indirection of it. Right? Trying to access through indirection, through a long film with many, 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 many interviews by perpetrators and survivors and onlookers. And there's a kind of cumulative effect, a round and around effect. You come around and you hear the same things again in slightly different form. It's a psychoanalytic mode of knowledge. It's a mode of knowledge that doesn't go straight and consciously to the goal, but can only do it indirectly. And what Lanzmann says, and what's going to be important in our looking at Isaac as we continue with this, is this sentence. He says, "I began to acknowledge my own blindness." That the only way to approach these survivors is with a posture of blindness, as if I don't see anything. I don't really understand. Therefore, he's off screen. Right? He's in a point at which he's just staring at the witness, and we see him looking. It's a voice, it's a sense of something he can't really understand. And then he says this blindness was for me the vital condition of creation. Blindness is a handicap. You would think it would prevent you from doing what you want to do. Lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. And he's saying, no, this kind of lack of understanding is an absolute condition. It's a life condition for creation. And what he wants is creation. Not understanding, but to create his own not understanding, his own living sense of what is properly inconceivable. And in the process, the victims also come somewhere towards that indirectly. Now, Isaac's blindness, I want to say, is also an essential basis on which he can come to bless, to give blessing. It's a vital condition for the blessing, as Rashi says, that he couldn't have been given without the blindness. And that's not just a handicap, but actually that there is something valuable about the kind of blindness that Isaac experiences. It allows him to do something that he couldn't otherwise do. Let's go back to the sources on your page now. Here in number 3, you have a midrash. It's from a collection, the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, that is distinguished by its imaginative vitality. This is a particular midrash collection that goes very deep. And here, Rabbi Yehuda addresses the moment when the knife touched Isaac's neck. In other words, the moment of the wound. If there was to be a wound, this would be the moment, a physical wound, the moment of trauma, which is a place where, personally, my imagination doesn't want to go. I really don't want to have to think about. That's the one thing I never want to think about the experience of the victim at the moment of impact. That is beyond anything that I want to think about. But here the Midrash goes to that place. When the knife touched his neck, parcha v'yatsa nafsho shel Yitzchak. The soul of Isaac. Nefesh is often translated soul. I think it's precisely wrong. That's a wrong translation. Nefesh in the Bible itself and in later literature means something more like the body than the soul, surprisingly. Linfosh is to breathe. It's the breathing apparatus. It's the vital organisms. It's the digestive system in the Bible. Sometimes it's a person as a living, breathing whole. You wanted to say something?
I just had a question. Isn't there sometimes connotation of nefesh as throats?
As?
Throat, like
the throat, exactly. Yes, as the throat. The swallowing, bring. Different parts of the body are actually associated with the nefesh. It's the appetitive body. It's that which desires. It's that which desires life. Libido, maybe. I'm not sure. But here, that whole life-desiring aspect of Isaac flies away and leaves him. That's the way it's put literally. Parcha v'yatsa. In a sense, his life departs from his body. Everything that's vital about him departs. Now, that expression, his life flies away, parcha nishmato, is sometimes used to describe the shock, the impact, the trauma of a moment, which is like a death. And sometimes it's used to describe simply death. Parcha nishmato is a way of describing death. That suddenly there is the one's life flutters its wings and leaves. Parcha flies away. Here it means death. Isaac actually died. That's quite an extraordinary statement. I thought he almost died. Wasn't that the story? He almost died. He's a survivor. A survivor is someone who didn't die. And when we hear that someone is a survivor, we tend to think that's good news, that they evaded death. And here it turns out that the survivor actually died. And he died, and then immediately afterwards, when God called out to Abraham, don't set hand on the lad, al tishlach yadcha al anar, in other words, stop right there, then Isaac's soul returned to his body. Then Isaac's life returned to his body. So he had a split second, let's say, in which he crossed the line and then returned. There's a death and a resurrection here. And the result is that he stands firmly on his feet afterwards. As the Midrash wants to say, it's almost humorous. Here he comes back from nowhere, and he gets down off the altar, and he stands firmly on his feet in the Midrashic imagination. And he says, and he knew that in this way the dead will be revived at the end of days. That at the end, he knows about the truth of the resurrection of the dead, that this is what's going to happen to everybody. What other people may know by faith, at best, people believe in this or don't believe in this, in the resurrection of the dead. For Isaac is a matter of knowledge. It's a matter of experience. He's been there. He knows it in his own body, and so he opens his mouth and he coins blessing, and he says, Baruch atah Hashem mechayeh hametim. Blessed are you, O God, who revives the dead, which is the second blessing in the Shmona Esrei, in the 3 times a day prayer, and which is attributed now to Isaac, because he was the one who had a peculiar knowledge of resurrection, that he had been there. He had gone and come. The world had blanked out for him and then come back to him. Now, it's a very dramatic way of saying something that I think is not so singular, I would suggest. We've all died and been resurrected many times, probably, in the course of a life. There are jolts in which we lose a sense of time, in which we lose our place in time. And there are jolts of all kinds: intense love, intense suffering of one kind or another. Perhaps the first night that a baby spends in the world, suddenly there is sleep, and there is a departure from the wide awake world, and then there is a return suddenly to this very different world of the mother and light and touch and so on. That is, we undergo many shocks in the course of our lives. We're expected somehow to endure many, many things in the course of our lives. Call it death and resurrection. That is, as one world to another world, and then a return to the first world. And that is something that Isaac now comes to represent at its purest, as if he was the way. If you want to understand something about this, about the essence of this, Isaac is the person. That he goes through what is involved really in survival. There's no real great difference then between survival and resurrection. You know, the survivor, why is it that survivors are not simply people who live their lives, you know, beaming and singing songs for the rest of their lives? Because, of course, they've survived. They should just be grateful and happy. Why is it the survivors have a very high rate of suicide, for instance? That is Isaac's reaction. It's a delayed reaction that happens only after the blessing story, when he's an old man. Right? There is a moment, you remember, where he's given the blessing to the wrong son, to Jacob, and then the right son, Esau, turns up crying and says, "What happened to my blessing? What did you do here? Haven't you kept something for me too?" And Isaac's reaction then is, "Vayecharad charada gedola ad me'od." Now, it couldn't be more intense. It's really excessive. It's deliberately excessive. And Isaac trembled, shuddered, with an intense shuddering very much. It's piled on there, as if to say, this is something indescribable. You know, we're really going beyond words here. We're at a loss for words. There is such a deep shudder when he realizes what has just happened. Why so intense? After all, so he gave the blessing to the wrong son. You might say, very sensibly, and that really is it's a radical question about the whole story. We might say, let him just withdraw the blessing. It was given in error. He didn't know what he was doing. He was deceived, so he should just withdraw it. You know, mayesh. It's not such a big. In fact, Jacob expects that to happen. You know, it's there in the story. When his mother persuades him to do this masquerade, he says, "No, I don't want to do it. It's not going to be any good, because in the end he'll find out, and then I'll get a curse and not a blessing." You know, it's obvious that that's going to happen. So what's the point of this? What's the point of the masquerade? Well, as it turns out, Isaac shudders exceedingly, as if excessively, for this event. And so one midrash comes, I didn't put it on your page, the Midrash Tanchuma, and just says calmly, this shuddering was greater than that other shuddering. What other shuddering? It must be referring to the Akedah, where there is no shuddering officially in the text. In the text, we don't read about Isaac's reaction at all at the moment of impact, at that moment. There is no reaction on the part of Isaac. Isaac is not there as a subject, it seems. And I'm suggesting he's not there as a subject, not because the Torah is not interested in him, but because that is the traumatic response. One loses one's subjectivity. But there's a kind of splitting or dissociation of some kind, classically, that there is some sense that he can't possess his own experience. What happens is that in his old age, he has an experience that in some way rhymes with the Akedah. You know what I mean by rhymes? Yeah, it's not the same, of course. And it's an experience of something happening that he can't quite master. He can't quite take it on. And what I want to discuss for the time we have left is what makes it so unpossessable. What is so unfathomable about this experience that he has as he blesses the wrong son? If it's simply that he blesses him in error, then that's not so radical. That can always be corrected after. But something else apparently happens that gets such a deep reaction out of him that it must also be a triggering of the old trauma, which is exactly what the scholars who research trauma have to say about how trauma is ultimately possessed. That what happens is that at some point later there is a reenactment of some kind. There is a re-trauma. Something else happens that in some way involves you in the original trauma. It echoes it in some way and it triggers it. And so the reaction may seem excessive the second time, but it's so strong because it echoes the first time. It's the first time, it's for being dealt with for the first time, late in life. That technical, quote unquote, tempo of trauma is what the Midrash is describing about Isaac and the relation between those two events of his life in which he was totally passive, it seems. What is in common between those two events? Why does the later one rhyme with the earlier one? Where is the rhyme? And what is the shuddering? Why does one shudder? Jacques Derrida asks the question, the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, in a book called The Gift of Death. He makes it's a very serious question. He says, what does the body mean to say when it shudders? It's a strange experience to find yourself involuntarily shaking in a way that you can't control. It's a literary expression to shudder, but how many times do you experience it in a life? It's not such a common experience. I hear that it happened to me slightly. Yes, in childbirth sometimes it happens. There's a feeling of, it feels like being cold, that suddenly your body is shaking a little bit. I've seen it happen very recently to someone very close to me who was sick, and suddenly he started shaking. And there is something that is going on here that puts all these cases together in some ways. It unites all these. So Derrida says there's a secret here. There's something strange about this shudder. What is my body doing? What's my body telling me when it shudders? And what he says is something like this. He says, the experience I have is an experience of not understanding what I am doing. That my body is shuddering and I'm not shuddering. Why am I shuddering? I is something that I'm not totally in control of here. And it's a feeling of dissymmetry, he says. Dissymmetry between someone who sees me and a feeling of being seen and incapable of seeing the seer. That I can't see the one who sees me. I am not a subject who's equal to what is being done to me. Now, if the seer is God, and I don't know what Derrida means exactly, whether he means to refer in some kind of traditional idiom to God, then it would mean, that's a very traditional Jewish idea, God is called the one who sees unseen. That's an uncanny and an unnerving experience for the human being who is seen. To know that you are seen by God who is invisible to you. Because seeing is an act of possession, in a way. The gaze of the other. Someone looks at you. In a way, it's an act of power. They're taking you over. They're trying to involve you in their world and their meanings. If you can't look straight back at them, if you have to suffer just being looked at without looking, you are in a very vulnerable situation. That's an uncanny, it's a dissymmetry, which is really, it's close to the bone. It's not a pleasant thing. I remember once having the fantasy, I don't know why I tell these intimate things when I'm teaching, but it's the only way for me to try to clarify what I mean. I was going to have a medical procedure done to me, and I was really angry about it. I just didn't want this man, this surgeon, on some primal level. I didn't want him looking at me and interfering with me. So I threatened to bring a camera into the examination room and film him as he was doing it. And I realized, of course, I wouldn't do that, but I just realized why I had that fantasy. That it was exactly that feeling. I want to give him the feeling of being looked at as he is looking. Now, the sense of shuddering then would be that feeling of lacking eyes to look back at and to understand and to put it in place. And that is why Isaac shudders now and why he shuddered back then. And I want now to approach, finally, the sense that, first of all, what Isaac experiences in this most dramatic event of the Akedah is and the shudder that finishes the story for him is something that all human beings experience and all the Jewish people experienced in one collective event. That the Jewish people at Mount Sinai shuddered. Right? That the same word is used. Vayecharad kol ha'am. and the whole people shuddered. I think it says exceedingly, maybe even. Like the mountain that shuddered. The mountain shudders. Vayecharad kol ahar, vayecharad kol. It's a volcanic movement. An earthquake of some kind happens out there, and also to the people who are part of it. Are they shuddering within the general shuddering? But there is a sense that something radical is going on here. That volcano that's taking place, internal earthquake that's taking place, destabilizes all of us. Right? And there's some kind of collective memory that contains that event. Have a look at the midrash on your page. Number 4, rather quickly. The people asked for 2 things. There was a desire for 2 things from God. They wanted to see his glory and they wanted to hear his voice. In other words, they wanted a full mystical experience. They wanted the real thing. They didn't want to just be told about it by Moses as a delegate. They wanted to have it themselves. And they got what they wanted. Watch out what you wish for. You might sometimes get it. And they did see and they did hear. And so the Midrash goes on to say, quite demurely, that when they came to Sinai and God was revealed to them, their soul flew away. There's the same expression. They died of it. They died of the impact of God's revelation. All right, they wanted it, but they didn't know what they were asking for. They couldn't stand it. Right? And they died, lo haya bahem koach la'amod. They didn't have the strength to stand. They couldn't stand it. They couldn't remain stable. They started shuddering, and they just dissolved. They just disappeared into elsewhere. And what was the cause of that? Simply the fact that God spoke. Right? God didn't do anything lethal to them. God simply spoke to them. He spoke the 10 Commandments. Aseret hadibrot. A dibra of God had the power simply to wipe them out. That's the effect of speech. And in case you never had such an experience, dear reader, you haven't yet had a mystical experience of that order, or you don't remember the original Sinai experience, it's repressed somewhere inside you. The Midrash helpfully quotes from Song of Songs. And Song of Songs is the place to go to understand the inner experience of the stories of the Torah, the history of the Torah, particularly the epic parts that have to do with the Exodus and the revelation at Sinai. You want to know what it really felt like, go to the Song of Songs. And what do we read there? 3 words. Nafshi yatsa bedabro. My life left me when he spoke. And that is talking about the love of a man and a woman, that the woman experiences her life just flying away. A kind of jolt at simply the voice of the lover. Well, if you've never had the mystical experience, then I suppose all of us have had the other thing, have had the experience of love. And the sense of somewhere not knowing who one is anymore when one hears the voice of the person whom one loves. That irreducible impact of love is what lays the people out dead, as it were. There they are lying at the base of Sinai. They're completely parcha, they're the ghost, they've given up the ghost. And then in a kind of humorous ending, the Torah pleads with God and says, look, this is the wedding day, you're marrying off your daughter, I'm your daughter. You're marrying off your daughter, and all the wedding guests, all the celebrants are lying dead. It's not a very happy wedding, this. So God brings back their life into their bodies, and that is the effect of Torah on mystical experience. If you live in a life of Torah, the implication is then you find a way of domesticating to some extent, like in a marriage. You domesticate the jolt of passion, that electrifying and in a way lethal effect of passion, and you make it part of your life in a regulated sort of way. And that's Torat Hashem Tzemima Meshivat Nafesh. It restores life rather than destroying life. So we've all been a subject, according to this, of that kind of jolt at Sinai, that kind of charada. I once taught this material in this building, actually, and a couple of minutes after I'd moved on from it to something else, there was an earthquake. It was the only earthquake that I actually have experienced, and there's a silence in the room as the earth moves, you know, and then we started laughing. It was just this laughter, which is a kind of, you know, it's almost a, I don't know what to say. It's an erotic laughter, you know. It's just a sense of, you know, the earth moved, you know, just when we have been talking about this. So that's my personal experience of this kind of moment. And with this, I come back to the earth, to the ground. So what is the story of the blessing? And I want to present, in the few minutes we have, a version, an interpretation of the blessing story, the misblessing. What does Isaac think he's doing when he blesses the wrong son? Mostly it's read as if, indeed, it's an error. It's a mistake, you know, it's a deception by Jacob, and he thinks he's blessing one son, and he's actually blessing the other. And then he is rudely and terribly disabused at the end. If so, though, why is it that he says what he says immediately after the charada? After he's shaken to the roots of his being, he says, V'gam baruch yeh. And indeed he shall be blessed. The one who came and took your blessing, whoever he is, it's as if he doesn't really know who it was. You know, me, Ephah, who was it then? And he says, and indeed he shall be blessed. How can he say that? What kind of comfort is that to Esau, who has just lost his blessing? Instead of trying to say, oh, I'm so sorry and I'm so ashamed and how could I have let it happen? And I take it back and I give you, right? You would have thought that's what the result, the response to your error is usually an experience of shame and of acknowledgement of something wrong that you did. And instead, he stands by the blessing. And he says, V'gam baruch yeh. And indeed he shall be blessed. Why does he say that? If it was just a matter of an innocent error, if it was a matter of... I want to suggest something that's based on the Abarbanel, who was a 15th century, I think, Spanish person of many talents. Among others, he wrote a commentary on the whole of Tanakh. And the passage is on your page. You're welcome to read it if you have the Hebrew. It's not translated, unfortunately. Number 7. I'll just read you the first line as a way of beginning to talk about this concept of the scene. It starts like this. It's the end of the first line. Ein safek etzli. I have no doubt. That's the way the writer, the Abarbanel, begins his theory. He says, I have no doubt. Now, when someone says, I have no doubt, it presumably means that he knows about doubt, that he knows that everything is arguable. You know, this is my theory, he's saying, but I'm so certain of this theory that I'm willing to say that there's no room for doubt at all. Ein safek etzli ki sheyitzchak nitbalbel bedavar im hayahu Esav o Yaakov. I have no doubt that Isaac was mixed up, confused, about the question of whether it was Jacob or Esau who stood in front of him. That is, I am willing to go on record as saying, with absolute certainty, that Isaac was completely in doubt when he made the decision to bless at that moment, that he was in serious doubt. He was and he will then use the word safek constantly in the course of the paragraph, that he was in a situation of doubt, of radical doubt, throughout the scene in which he interrogates Jacob, you remember? He doesn't just bless him, but he asks him twice, Ha'ata ze b'ni Esav? Are you really my son Esav? That clearly is doubt, you know, that he is not sure at all that it's Esau who's standing in front of him. Well, there's two ways of not being sure. One is you cannot be sure that it's Esau and realize then that it's Jacob. But what the Abarbanel wants to say is that he never knows who it is, that he remains in doubt throughout the whole scene. And that's why he has to keep on investigating. And he not only asks him questions and listens to his voice, but he touches him. He uses all his senses that he has, all the other 4 senses. He touches him, he listens to him, he smells him, he tastes his food, right? He kisses him and smells him. And in the end, it's the smell that does it. Re'eh reach b'ni k'reach hasadeh asher be'echo Hashem. He smells this sun like the smell of the field that God has blessed. He smells a kind of fragrance, pastoral fragrance, from the clothes that Jacob is wearing. And then he blesses. What does he think when he's blessing? And the argument of the Abarbanel is, and he goes through it in some detail, is that he doesn't come to any conclusion at all. That in his desire to understand unequivocally who it is, to give a name to the person, he is baffled. And he experiences an extreme bafflement, an extreme bewilderment of not being able consciously to identify the person who's standing in front of him. Rather strangely, he uses the word zeh over and over again, 3 times. Are you this one, my son Esau? Are you this, my son Esau? Ma zeh miharta limtso b'ni. 3 times he talks about a thisness, as if he's saying, really, and the Orach Chaim translates it like this, he blesses in the end this one who is in front of him. He leaves aside the desire to understand, to define, to know who it is, to give a name to him, to know unequivocally who he is. And in the end, he accepts something ambiguous, a hybrid being. When I say a hybrid, a kind of monster, it's monstrous for the human mind not to be able to come to clear understandings, not to be able to say, yes, I know who you are now, and now I can bless you. And to go on a completely different basis, on a traumatic basis, actually, for the blessing. To acknowledge blindness in a very deep sense. And to say, I am blind, and therefore, in a way, there's a kind of privilege in blindness. That the privilege is that I needn't come to my most habitual response. Oh, if it's Jacob, I know exactly how I respond to Jacob. And if it's Esau, I know how I respond to Esau. I love him. I want to give him the blessing. And instead, he's pushed off that comfort zone into a place of ambivalence, into a place of hybridity. There's a hybrid reality in front of him. And he knows about such hybrid realities because he's been in the Akedah, which is also a place that cannot be mastered, that he couldn't, it's incomprehensible. There's something where the consciousness fails, and one is thrown back on something else, on an experience that only becomes possible if you're not too lucid. Yeah? Lucidity and correctness prevent a different kind of movement of the mind. Think of ambiguous objects. I brought one along. You are the only class this week that I actually remember to bring it. I thought you might enjoy it. You probably know it very well. Yes, one of the classic ambiguous objects that people like to write about. Ernest Gombrich, the art historian and scholar, writes about ambiguity in a very powerful way. Old lady, young lady. In order to see the other, you have to flip. There's a kind of mental flip. You can't actually see both at the same time, right? You see her chin, the young woman's chin. That becomes the nose of the old lady. I'm going to pass it round so you can, in case you're not familiar with it. You can't see both at the same time because the same lines are used to different purpose in the 2 perceptions. Different uses made of the same lines. So you can't possibly see both at the same time. That means you can't have a lucid, inclusive view of the reality that's in front of you. You can only have a sense of consciousness flipping. And it draws your attention to the movement of your mind. That's what Gombrich says. I think it's very beautiful. That is, that as long as you can depend on habitual perception. I see a picture of a young woman, I know exactly what that is. I don't have to think, it's not me thinking about it. It's just there. It's reality. There's a young woman. But if my mind does this switch, I become aware of how much I read reality. Ambiguity makes us aware of that I'm reading in 2 opposite ways, and I'm capable of moving from one to the other, and of containing somewhere that movement. Right? I'm not containing the image, I'm containing the movement, the charada, if you will. That becomes possible only when one's lucidity and clarity and consciousness are in some way taken backstage. That one is what Freud called free association, which can only happen if one lets go of consciousness somewhere. It doesn't impose one's usual sense of what's proper and right to say, what's proper and right to think. And something of that is what happens to Yitzchak, I'm suggesting. And it happens in a way that allows him to be aware of the one who is in front of him, to be aware in a way that he's never been before. Maybe this hybrid being represents a Yaakov who has something of Esav in him. Maybe there's a Jacob Esau here. Perhaps Jacob is partly Esau. Perhaps Esau is partly Jacob. They're twins. How can they be so totally black and white? Yeah. And suddenly a different dimension of experience, which is really an old dimension for Isaac. He's been here before. The Akedah represented something of the same shifting of departure and return. And now he has it in relation to his son, and something comes out of him that's called a blessing. Now, the blessing then is not willed. It's not a result of an act of will. I don't think blessings ever are. Blessings are a state of altered consciousness. That is, they're a state in which one sees in an other way. One sees the other whom one is blessing with a difference. There's an act of creation involved. One creates the other that one blesses. It's the movement of the mind of the blesser, which sees a reality that is not so obviously there. Smell is a powerful medium for such alterations. Incense, perfume, things that do things to your consciousness. That you're no longer just fully, looking at the logical outlines of things. The Sforno says something rather beautiful there on your page. It's number 8, the following passage here. It's when he smells the garments of the person he's blessing that he begins to bless. Why? So the Sforno, I'll paraphrase it very, very briefly. He puts it like this. He says, the field, the produce of the field, is a reality blessing. That is, that when God creates the world and he gives human beings the grass of the field to eat and the products of the field, that is a way of keeping us alive. It's an act of necessity that we need to eat. But then there is something beyond that God gives, which is the smell of the field. And the smell of the field is pure ta'anug. That's pure pleasure. And pleasure in some way is higher than necessity. Pleasure takes you, it broadens you. It's not just the narrowness of what I actually need in order to survive. It opens me up in some way. The experience of ta'anug, the experience of the smell. It makes me aware of things that I will never be aware of if I'm too tied to necessity. I'm too tied to what I actually need. And that sense of things is what's behind Isaac's conviction that the blessing, whoever it was in front of him, that the blessing took. That in some way he can't be unblessed. That something happened that doesn't have to do with conscious choice. And that there are areas of human experience that don't yield to conscious control. Therefore, perhaps, his love of food. That's also part of the same experience. And Hasidic writers celebrate Isaac's love of food. The Hasidic writers say, it's really quite unexpected, they say the area of taste, the area, that sensuality that has to do with taste and enjoying food, that's also an area that's not totally within our control. Why is it that I so much like this and I don't like that? I can try to persuade myself that, it really, I like carrots just as much as I like chocolate cake. But somehow it doesn't quite work. I can't quite persuade myself of that fact. The fact that there is something in me that doesn't yield to reason is a subject for celebration. It allows me a different access to a different dimension of experience than I would have if I were, an automaton who just acted only by reason. Now, that sense of things, Isaac is the carrier of that whole sense of things. He is the one whose traumatic disappearance, his disappearance from possessing his own reality, opens up, paradoxically, something to him. Other ways of experiencing, instead of dismissing one child in blessing Esau, he comes to a sense that whoever it is in front of me, doesn't insist on knowing who it is, whoever it is, it's happening. It's simply happening. And I'd like to finish with a Hasidic passage. Have a look at the last passage on your page. About irresistible experience. About, in a way, traumatic experience where one is possessed rather than possessing. Kind of ecstatic passivity. The rabbis, the Hasidic rabbis, were known to have this experience of, it's called Vehi kenagen hamenagen. When the instrumentalist would play, then the hand of God would come and inspire the prophet. Yeah. That music does that to one. Smell does that to one. Music does that to one. It takes one away from one's lucid, conscious state and puts one somewhere else. And so our Hasidic master here, the Ishbitzer, puts it like this. He says, when Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, if you read the way it's read according to the cantillation in the synagogue, when we read the Torah officially, the cantillation sign, the trop sign, are you familiar with this? It's called Zarkal Segol, over these words. When he finished, Asher kala levarech, he kila levarech. He finished, there's a kind of trill, there's a prolonged trill over those words. Why? What a way of interpreting. Why? Because Isaac found it very difficult to stop blessing. In other words, he's so involved in the blessing, there's a kind of musical pleasure that he has in the blessing, a sense of rightness, which has very little to do with conscious choice, that he's reluctant to stop blessing. When do we have access to this aspect of the story? Only when we are in Bet HaKnesset, only when we are in shul once a year, and we listen to the actual reading, and we hear that trill in the voice, that shudder, in a way, in the voice. Then, at that moment, we're aware of that particular reaction on the part of Isaac, who is worked on at this moment by something that inspires him. A word about Jacob, whose ethical status through all this we haven't touched on at all. We haven't talked at all about how much we deplore what Jacob decides to do. That's another subject. I've been talking about Isaac. But I do want to just mention Jacob in terms of desire, in terms of longing. Jacob says when his mother wants him to do this masquerade, he says, Ulai yimosheni avi. But perhaps my father will touch me, and then the game's up. If he touches me, he'll feel my smooth skin, and he'll know I'm not Esau. And then I'll get a curse and not a blessing. So clearly he is afraid of being touched. He says, Ulai yimosheni, he dreads it. At the same time, and here is another Hasidic interpretation, psychoanalytic interpretation, Ulai usually means something you wish for. There's a wish in Ulai. Would that. It's not I dread that. Ulai is usually towards the positive. It's I wish that. I wish something in Jacob feels against his own best interests. I wish Father would touch me. Maybe he has not been much touched by his father. His father has not had the kind of direct, loving relationship with him that he's had with Esau. And there's something in Jacob that would like, very simply, to be fondled by his father. There should be that engagement that is terrifying on the one hand. We have to wrap up. I'm not finishing. It's a terrifying engagement on the one hand. On the other hand, there's something that he desires because it's engagement. And perhaps it would allow his father to see him differently, ambiguously. rather than clearly. And we are wrapping up now. Thank you very much.